It was a bustling afternoon at the airport, the kind where everyone seems to be in a rush, darting between gates and juggling carry-ons. The air was thick with the usual chaos. Boarding announcements crackling over the intercom, families trying to stick together, and business travelers glued to their phones. Amid the crowd stood Marcus, a tall, confident black man dressed sharply in a tailored suit. He wasn't in a hurry. He moved with an ease that suggested he'd been through this routine countless times before. But today, his calm demeanor would be tested in a way he hadn't anticipated. Marcus approached the gate counter with his first-class ticket in hand, ready to board a flight that would take him to an important meeting across the country. He was no stranger to first-class travel. It was part of his life now. But as he handed over his boarding pass, the gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a clipped tone and a no-nonsense expression, paused. Her eyes flickered briefly to the ticket and then to Marcus, as if trying to reconcile the two. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice cool and professional, yet tinged with something unspoken. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Marcus raised an eyebrow, momentarily confused. "Yes, I know," he replied, his tone polite but firm. He gestured to the ticket in her hand. "That's my boarding pass." The agent glanced at the pass again, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, the question laced with an undertone that Marcus had heard too many times before. The implication hung in the air like a heavy cloud, unspoken but unmistakable. Marcus took a deep breath, resisting the urge to let frustration creep into his voice. "I'm quite sure," he said evenly. "That ticket is valid, and I'd appreciate it if you could scan it." But instead of doing so, the agent hesitated, her gaze narrowing as if she were looking for some excuse to turn him away. The seconds stretched uncomfortably, drawing the attention of other passengers nearby. Some glanced over, curious but hesitant to intervene, while others looked away, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge what was unfolding. "Sir," the agent finally said, her voice growing colder, "I'll need to verify this. Please step aside." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside as requested. He wasn't unfamiliar with situations like this, moments where his success, his place in the world, was questioned simply because of how he looked. Still, he didn't want to escalate the situation. He waited patiently as the agent called someone on the phone, her voice dropping to a whisper as she explained the issue. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in the air grew thicker. Other passengers continued to board, the line moving steadily, but Marcus remained off to the side, his valid ticket now a source of scrutiny rather than access. He caught a few murmurs from nearby travelers, some sympathetic, others indifferent. Finally, the agent hung up the phone and returned to Marcus, her expression unreadable. "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up," she said, though her tone lacked any real apology. "You'll need to wait until the rest of the passengers have boarded. We'll sort this out after." Marcus felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest. This wasn't a mix-up. It was something else entirely. But before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to a man in a crisp uniform, clearly a higher-up in the airline staff. He approached the counter with an air of authority, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The gate agent straightened, her demeanor shifting slightly, but she still maintained her stance. "This passenger claims to have a first-class ticket," she explained, her words carefully chosen, "but I needed to verify its authenticity." The man frowned, turning to Marcus. "May I see your ticket, sir?" Marcus handed it over without hesitation, meeting the man's gaze directly. The airline employee scanned the ticket, his brow furrowing for a moment before his expression shifted. He glanced back at Marcus, then at the gate agent, and something clicked in his eyes, a realization that seemed to make him suddenly uncomfortable. Sir, the man said, his tone more respectful now, I apologize for the inconvenience. There's no issue with your ticket. You're free to board at your leisure. But before Marcus could respond, the gate agent interjected, her face betraying a flicker of doubt. Are you sure? She asked, her voice lower but still audible enough to reach Marcus. I mean, it's not every day we see. The man cut her off with a sharp glance, his voice firm. That will be enough. Marcus, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, decided to let the moment speak for itself. He stepped forward, reclaiming his ticket, but not before looking directly at the gate agent. Thank you for your time, he said, his voice steady and composed. As he made his way toward the boarding lane, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some passengers looked on with curiosity, others with quiet admiration for how he had handled himself. But just as Marcus handed his ticket to the final attendant at the gate, the man in the uniform hurried after him. Sir, he said, his voice low but urgent, may I have a word with you before you board? Marcus paused, his curiosity piqued. Of course, he said, stepping aside once more. The other passengers filed past, giving the two men a wide berth. The airline employee leaned in slightly, his tone now more cautious. I didn't realize who you were. If I may ask, are you? Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes revealing a hint of the humor he'd kept hidden during the earlier tension. Yes, he said simply. I own this airline. For a moment, the man looked stunned, his professionalism faltering as the weight of the revelation sank in. Behind them, the gate agent stood frozen, her face a mask of shock as she overheard the exchange. Marcus glanced back at her briefly, then returned his attention to the employee. I trust this won't happen again, he said, his tone calm but firm. And with that, Marcus turned and walked down the jet bridge, leaving behind a stunned silence that hung in the air like an echo. As Marcus settled into his first-class seat, the tension from the encounter at the gate began to dissolve, but the memory lingered in his mind. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged based on appearances, and he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. He wasn't just another passenger. He was the owner of the airline. That fact, he knew, carried weight far beyond the single interaction. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Marcus leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window at the bustling activity on the tarmac. His thoughts drifted back to the journey that had brought him here. Marcus hadn't always lived this life of tailored suits and private business meetings. His success was hard-earned, built brick by brick through perseverance, ambition, and a refusal to let others define his worth. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Marcus had learned early on the importance of resilience. His parents, who worked tirelessly to make ends meet, had instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity. They had also prepared him for the reality of navigating a world where his skin color would often invite assumptions before he even spoke. But they had also encouraged him to dream big, to aim for a life that wasn't confined by the expectations of others. His passion for aviation had been sparked during a school field trip to an airport. Watching planes take off and land, he'd been mesmerized by the thought of connecting people and places across the world. That day, he promised himself that he would one day be a part of that world, not just as a pilot or employee, but as a leader. It had taken years of determination, countless obstacles, and more than a few moments of doubt, but Marcus had kept his promise to himself. And now he owned one of the most respected airlines in the industry. As the plane began to taxi, Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the faint murmur of voices in the first-class cabin. The gate agent's earlier behavior had clearly not gone unnoticed. A few passengers were quietly discussing the incident, their glances occasionally darting toward him. Marcus met one of those glances, a man seated across the aisle, and offered a polite nod. The man hesitated for a moment before leaning over. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but respectful. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back at the gate. I just wanted to say, you handled that with a lot of grace." Marcus smiled faintly. "Thank you," he replied, his tone measured. "I've learned it's often better to let actions speak louder than words." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Still," he said, "it shouldn't have happened in the first place. People can be quick to judge." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the man for a moment, noting the genuine concern in his eyes. "You're right," he said finally. "But sometimes moments like that reveal more than they intend to. They remind us of the work that still needs to be done." The man seemed to consider this, then extended his hand. "I'm David, by the way." "Marcus," he replied, shaking David's hand. As the flight progressed, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the gate agent's reaction. Was it born out of ignorance, prejudice, or was it a simple mistake amplified by underlying biases? He wasn't one to dwell on negativity, but the incident felt like a microcosm of a larger issue, one that went beyond him and his success. It was a reminder that no matter how far he'd come, there were still perceptions to challenge and barriers to break. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the gate agent was grappling with the weight of what had transpired. Her name was Karen, and while she prided herself on professionalism, she couldn't ignore the nagging sense of unease that had settled over her since Marcus walked away. She hadn't intended to offend him, or so she told herself. But deep down, she couldn't deny that her actions had been influenced by assumptions she hadn't even realized she held. Karen replayed the scene in her mind, her stomach tightening as she remembered the moment she learned who Marcus really was. The look in his eyes, the calm authority in his voice, it had shaken her in a way she hadn't expected. She'd spent years working in the airline industry, encountering passengers from all walks of life. But something about this interaction felt different. It wasn't just about a ticket or a boarding pass. It was about something deeper. Determined to make amends, Karen reached out to her supervisor, the man who had intervened at the gate. "I think I made a mistake earlier," she admitted, her voice quiet but resolute. "That passenger, I didn't treat him fairly." The supervisor, a seasoned professional named Paul, regarded her thoughtfully. "Mistakes happen," he said, "but what matters is how you address them. If you feel you owe him an apology, you should find a way to deliver it." Karen nodded, though she wasn't sure how she would go about it. She only knew that she couldn't let the incident fade into the background without taking responsibility for her actions. On board the flight, Marcus was beginning to relax, his mind shifting to the upcoming meeting that had prompted his journey. But just as he started reviewing the documents on his tablet, a flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Marcus," she said softly, "on behalf of the airline, I'd like to offer you a complimentary meal and beverage of your choice. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." Marcus acknowledged her with a nod, appreciating the gesture, but sensing that it was more than just standard protocol. The ripple effect of what had happened at the gate was still unfolding, and he knew it would likely follow him beyond this flight. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the gate agent was thinking now. Did she regret her actions? Had she learned anything from the encounter? He didn't harbor ill will toward her, but he hoped that the moment had left an impression, not just on her, but on anyone who had witnessed it. The tension continued to build, the unresolved conflict simmering beneath the surface. Marcus knew that his role as a leader wasn't just about running a successful airline. It was about setting an example, challenging perceptions, and creating opportunities for others who might face similar challenges. And though he didn't yet know how this particular story would unfold, he was determined to turn it into something meaningful. As the plane began its descent, the anticipation grew. Would this experience lead to change? Would the gate agent's assumptions give way to understanding? And how would Marcus use his platform to address the deeper issues at play? The answers were still ahead, waiting to be revealed. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, mentally preparing himself for the day ahead. The meeting waiting for him was significant, a deal that could open new opportunities, not just for his airline, but for the communities he aimed to uplift through his work. But as much as he tried to focus on what lay ahead, his thoughts kept circling back to the incident at the gate. It wasn't anger or bitterness that lingered, but a quiet determination. If moments like that could spark conversations or change even one perspective, then they carried a purpose beyond the discomfort they caused. Once the plane arrived at the terminal, Marcus was among the first to deboard. As he stepped off the jet bridge and into the bustling airport, he noticed a familiar face standing off to the side. It was the gate agent, Karen, her posture tense, but her expression one of intent. Marcus paused for a moment, considering whether to engage or walk away. But something in her eyes, a mixture of nervousness and sincerity, made him decide to stop. "Mr. Marcus," Karen began, her voice quieter than before. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you earlier. I made assumptions that were wrong, and I let my biases affect my judgment. I'm deeply sorry for that." Marcus studied her for a moment, weighing her words. He could see that the apology was genuine, though it was clear she was still grappling with the weight of her actions. "Thank you," he said, his tone measured. "I appreciate you taking the time to reflect on what happened. It's not always easy to confront our own assumptions." Karen nodded, her face softening slightly with relief. "I've been thinking about it ever since you boarded. I realized this isn't just about one mistake. It's about how I treat people every day, and I want to do better." Marcus offered a faint smile, his voice steady. "Awareness is the first step toward change. What matters now is what you do with it." Karen hesitated, then extended her hand. "Thank you for your patience and understanding," she said, "and for reminding me to look beyond what's on the surface." Marcus shook her hand briefly, then stepped away, his strides purposeful as he moved toward his next destination. He didn't need to say more. He knew that moments like these often spoke louder than words. Later that day, after the meeting had wrapped up successfully, Marcus found himself reflecting on the events of the past 24 hours. The incident at the gate, Karen's apology, and the ripple effects of that moment. All of it underscored the broader challenges he faced as a Black man in a position of power. But it also reaffirmed his commitment to using his platform to drive change. He thought back to the countless individuals who had supported him along his journey, mentors, friends, and family who had believed in his potential even when others couldn't see it. He knew his success wasn't just his own. It was a testament to those who had fought for a better future before him and a responsibility to pave the way for those who would follow. By the time Marcus returned home, the incident at the airport had already started to fade into the background of his busy life. But its impact lingered. He decided to use the experience as fuel for a new initiative within his airline, a program focused on diversity and inclusion training for all employees, from gate agents to executives. If moments like this could teach anything, it was the importance of empathy, understanding, and accountability. In the weeks that followed, Karen's name crossed his desk once more. She had enrolled in the airline's new program, attending sessions and volunteering to lead workshops for her peers. Word had spread among the staff about her efforts, And though Marcus never reached out to her directly again, he was glad to see her turning her words into actions. As for Marcus, he continued to move forward, his vision expanding with each new challenge and opportunity. He knew the world wouldn't change overnight, but he also knew the power of small, intentional steps. Every flight, every interaction, every decision was a chance to make a difference, not just in the industry, but in the lives of those who crossed his path. And so, as the next flight boarded and another journey began, Marcus carried with him the same resolve that had brought him this far: to rise above the noise, to challenge the status quo, and to lead by example. Because sometimes the most meaningful changes start not with grand gestures, but with quiet human moments that ripple far beyond what we can see.